Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History. Today, we're going to be talking about the French and Indian War. Although, to properly discuss wars between the English and the Indians, as well as the English and various Europeans, we have to step all the way back to the beginning of English settlement in North America. In Jamestown, the English had fought with the Indians almost from the beginning. The massacre in 1622 had wiped out over a quarter of Virginia's population, but this was not a decisive defeat. Indeed, the long-term result was the destruction of most Indian tribes in eastern Virginia. In Massachusetts, the Pequot War, concluding in the horrific Mystic Massacre, and King Philip's War had been very destructive to the colonists, but even more destructive to the Indians, as the English colonists exacted their revenge. But by the late 1600s, wars in Europe were increasingly spreading to European colonies in North America. For example, the War of the League of Augsburg, as it was known in Europe, spread to North America in 1689, where the English colonists called it King William's War, after the King of England at the time. But this war did not settle much. Little land changed hands, and war in fact broke out once again just 4 years later in 1701. Now, I'm not going to tell you not to marry your cousin. She may be really attractive. I've never met her. But you shouldn't have your family do it generation after generation for 2 centuries, because there is a chance you will produce someone not unlike Charles II of Spain, who is physically deformed, with a lower jaw so large and misshapen he could not chew solid food. He was moderately retarded, and he was apparently sterile, although that may have been for the best. But it meant that when he died in 1701, he had no direct heirs to inherit the throne of Spain. Now, there were Habsburgs over in Austria, distant cousins to the Spanish Habsburgs, who did not typically intermarry with one another, but rather with all the other royal families of Europe. The King of France was also related to the Spanish Habsburgs, having married a Spanish Habsburg in his youth. And so Louis XIV of France believed that he, or at least one of his heirs, ought to inherit Spain. And so all of Europe went to war over the question of Spanish succession, which spread to America in 1702, where it was known as Queen Anne's War, after the British monarch at the time, the sister to the late Queen Mary, Mary II. Now, this war was particularly notable in the English colonies for the Deerfield Massacre in Massachusetts, where on February 29, 1704, French and soldiers and their Indian allies took advantage of snow that had piled up so deep against the walls around the fortified town of Deerfield. They were able to climb up the snowbanks, hop over the walls, kill many of the inhabitants, and capture many others. 56 English men, women, and children were killed in the Deerfield Massacre, over 100 taken captive and driven on a forced march through the snow to Canada. Some died on the trip, others were made prisoners of the Indians. Some were killed upon arrival. Many were eventually ransomed back to their community, and some chose to stay with the Indians, as life among the Indians was in some ways more free and liberated than life back in the English colonies. At the end of Queen Anne's War, the British gained Acadia from France, a region in New France, which they kept. During later wars between the French and the British would expel many of those Acadians, fearing that they would betray Britain, and many went to this French colony of Louisiana, where Acadians eventually slurred into the word Cajuns. But the treaty that ended Queen Anne's War did not really satisfy anyone in Europe, especially because the British continued to smuggle goods into Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, where in 1731 a Spanish Coast Guard captain boarded the ship Rebecca, searched it for contraband, and upon finding it, approached the captain of the ship, Robert Jenkins. Captain Jenkins said that he would not stand for this, and his king would not stand for this. The Spanish Coast Guard captain whipped out his sword, cut off Jenkins' ear, and said, "Take that back to your king." And some years later, he did. He had apparently pickled his ear and saved it in a bottle of vinegar, and it was paraded around England. Prime Minister Robert Walpole supposedly fainted upon seeing the pickled ear. England was already mad at Spain and used this as an excuse to declare war, the War of Jenkins' Ear, which in the end did not really solve anything in and of itself, although it did soon become part of a larger conflict, the War of Austrian Succession, because the last male ruler of Austria had died in 1740. He had no sons either, although he did have a daughter, Maria Theresa. As he had grown older and continued to have no sons, he had gotten other monarchs of Europe to declare they would accept his daughter inheriting the throne of Austria. In many parts of Central Europe, women could not legally inherit the throne, unlike, say, England or Spain or Scotland, where that was acceptable. But when Maria Theresa actually inherited the throne, some of those monarchs who had promised to accept her rule changed their minds and went to war to try to claim Austria outright, or at least seize some of its territory. The War of Austrian Succession spread to America in 1744, where the English colonists called it King George's War, after King George II. And from the point of view of the English colonies, one of the most notable events was the siege and capture of Fort Louisbourg off the coast of Canada. A vital fortress, a heavily defended fortress on island defending the entrance to the St. Lawrence River, a passageway to the heart of New France. The militia from New England captured this fortress, a truly glorious moment which they justifiably took great pride. And yet, when the war ended 3 years later, the treaty that ended the war exchanged a lot of land captured in the war, so that most land was returned to its original owners, including Louisbourg and Canada. And many New Englanders felt betrayed, felt that their contribution to the war effort, their sacrifices, had not been respected. One of many things that would lead to resentment between the colonies and Britain. By the mid-1700s, the English colonists in North America were very numerous. Their population had grown rapidly in the past century and a half, with at least 1.5 million British subjects in North America. But those 1.5 million people were largely confined to the Atlantic seaboard, with no settlement and little trade west of the Appalachian Mountains, whereas the vast territories of New France and Louisiana were inhabited by perhaps 50,000 Frenchmen. So, the English were increasingly jealous of all that French territory, the French increasingly worried about the British. Indeed, the British did covet, and in many cases officially claim, land that was also claimed by France, particularly the rich lands of the Ohio River Valley. And Virginia, a number of wealthy and influential men, including Lawrence and Augustine Washington and the royal governor Robert Dinwiddie, formed the Ohio Company of Virginia with the intent of claiming and settling, and of course selling at a profit, the land in the Ohio country. But this was claimed and occupied by the French. So in 1753, Ohio Company sent Lawrence and Augustus Washington's little half-brother, George, to investigate the French presence and tell them to leave. He traveled to Fort Le Boeuf, just south of Lake Erie, demanded the French go, to which they responded, no, and began construction of another fort, Fort Duquesne, in what is now southwestern Pennsylvania. Washington returned to Virginia and was sent back with more militia. They approached Fort Duquesne in May of 1754, ambushed and defeated a small group of French soldiers, but knew there were far more French soldiers in Fort Duquesne. So Washington ordered his men to build a fort of their own, which they called Fort Necessity. The French, outnumbering Washington about 600 to 400, attacked the fort July 3rd, 1754, and the next day, a less happy July 4th for Washington and some future ones, he was forced to surrender, having lost about a third of his men, but having demonstrated great personal bravery under fire. And so, when he was sent back to Virginia, he was still widely respected by many Virginians. He had at least fought the French, he had fought bravely. And, as fighting continued, he would lead Virginia's militia in a defense of the frontier against the Indians. But he would develop a grudge against the British, who refused to recognize his colonial militia rank of colonel. The British refused to recognize any rank above captain, and always treated Washington as a captain. So he and many other American leaders felt slighted by the regular British officers, although in turn the British felt that their forces were often much better, much more professional, than the American militia they were fighting alongside. In some cases they were correct. In other cases the militia were justified in viewing the British as unrealistic and unprepared for wilderness warfare. But this little battle in the Ohio River Valley over access to farms, and especially over access to furs for trapping, would soon expand, developing into what has traditionally been called the French and Indian War, which is not, as I imagined in my early youth, a war between the French and the Indians, but rather a war of the British against the French and some Indians, with other Indians on the side of the British. And this war eventually spread to the entire known world. In Europe, it would be known as the 7 Years' War, as it began in 1756 in Europe and lasted till 1763, but there would be fighting all over the world, as you can see on the map there. Again, with some Indians on the side of the British, notably the Iroquois, but also the Cherokee and some others. And so, as fighting was just beginning, colonial leaders from New England, New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland met in the Albany Conference. The initial purpose was to renew the Covenant Chain Agreement, whereby the Iroquois Indians would continue their alliance with Britain, largely through many gifts. Ultimately, 30 wagon loads of presents kept the Iroquois on the side of the English. But once they were all there, the delegates from the various colonies began to discuss creating a government to unify the colonies under a single President General, who would be in charge of Indian affairs, military matters, some aspects of finance and trade, a pretty limited central government, with local affairs still being almost entirely governed by local leaders. Benjamin Franklin was the main designer of this plan alongside the governor of New York. Indeed, he was inspired in part by the Iroquois Confederacy. Franklin also advertised this Albany Plan of Union with what is sometimes believed to be the first political cartoon created in America, imploring the people of America to join or die. But in the end, none of the colonies was willing to give up any power, even to be better able to defend themselves against the French and the Indians. 1755, the British government sent General Edward Braddock with 2 regiments of regular soldiers, about 2,000 men, to America, and he was very experienced on the battlefields of Europe. When the French became aware of this, they sent about 3,000 regular French soldiers to defend New France. Braddock's plan was to return to Fort Duquesne and capture or destroy it. The French, however, had strengthened the fort and stationed more men there. So to reduce this fort, Braddock had to bring along many men and many cannons. So he set off with about 2,000 men. Among them Daniel Boone, who was a wagon driver, and George Washington, who was in command of Virginia militia. They began cutting a road 110 miles long from western Pennsylvania to western Pennsylvania from western Maryland to the Allegheny Mountains. Braddock's force was large. It moved slowly. Some of his soldiers kept getting ahead of the heavy cannons, which slowed them down, separating Braddock's forces, who in their bright red uniforms were clearly visible in the woods. July 9th, 1755, they encountered a force of about 800 French and Indians, mostly Indians. And there's some debate whether this was a deliberate ambush by the French and the Indians, or it may have just been a chance meeting that the French took good advantage of and Braddock handled poorly. The fighting went very badly. Braddock's men were already separated, as some were behind with the cannons. Braddock himself was wounded and carried off the field, dying 4 days later. Washington and other officers tried to rally the men, but ultimately the army was forced to retreat. Although had Washington not been there, the retreat probably would have been even more disorderly than it was. At least 500 British soldiers were killed and left to rot. Their bleached bones were still visible to other armies passing through as much as 5 years later. At least as many more British soldiers were wounded. Fewer than 40 French and Indians were killed or wounded. And following Braddock's death, his body was buried in the middle of the road he had built, and his men marched across his grave to conceal it, so the Indians could not dig up his body and desecrate it. Although, about 50 years later, when his road, which remained in use, was being improved, his body was discovered and buried off to the side, and his tomb can be visited today if you're ever in that part of West Virginia. Now, in New France, the military commander-in-chief was the Marquis de Montcalm, who would turn out to be, in most cases, a brilliant and often successful leader. Now, at first, the British government vacillated between deciding whether they would fight a limited war in North America or focus on fighting their rivals in Europe or fighting a fully global war, and could not decide, if they did so, which part of the globe to focus on. Indeed, there would be fighting around the world. In South Asia, the British also fought the French and the Indians, just a different kind of Indian, and consolidated their power in India, starting around this time. But this indecision largely came to an end in 1757, when William Pitt became the Secretary of State for the Southern Department, a very powerful office in the British government that at the time included supervision of Britain's colonies. He believed the war could best be won by focusing Britain's energies on America. It would take a while for his efforts to pay off. Because as 1757 began, the French seemed to have all the advantages. They had stopped almost all British advances into French territory, had even captured some territory from the British around the Great Lakes. Their Indian allies raided settlements all along the frontier, killing, looting, and taking captives, some of whom in turn were later killed, often tortured to death, so they would have a chance to demonstrate bravery to make up for the embarrassment of having been captured. Others were enslaved. Some, though, were adopted into the tribe that had captured them. Others were eventually ransomed back by their families. And while the British made plans to attack Canada, they were pretty slow getting underway and ended up leaving the New York frontier poorly defended in the process. One of the undermanned forts on the frontier was Fort William Henry on the shores of Lake George in New York, just south of Lake Champlain, one of the major routes between British North America and French Canada. And Fort William Henry held about 600 regular British soldiers, about 1,200 militia, when Montcalm's forces and their Indian allies, about 8,000 men, laid siege to it in the summer of 1757. And after a long siege, the British surrendered. They were given very generous treatment, allowed to march out with their regimental flags and personal possessions, promised safe passage to the next fort down the road, Fort Edward. But the next day, as the British marched south, they were attacked by Montcalm's Indian allies. At least 700 British soldiers and militia were killed, wounded, or went missing. And those who were killed or wounded were often knocked in the head with tomahawks and war clubs or scalped. So, a pretty bad end for 1757 from the point of view of the British, especially those British who were at the back end of the line marching away from Fort William Henry. But under Pitt's leadership, things would begin to change, as he planned a major series of attacks on New France in 1758. Fort Louisbourg was retaken on, July 26, 1758, again after a long siege. And this opened up the St. Lawrence River Valley and the major cities of Quebec and Montreal to British invasion. The British returned to Fort Duquesne on November 24th, 1758. As the French realized the British were approaching, the French abandoned the fort, burning it as they left, hoping to destroy the fort and the supplies there. Although, after the British captured the remains of Fort Duquesne, they began to rebuild it and renamed it Fort Pitt, which eventually developed into the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And having thus secured the colonial frontier and cut off French access to the St. Lawrence River, the British were ready to strike at the heart of New France, at Quebec itself, a city with very strong walls on the landward side and steep cliffs protecting its approaches from the St. Lawrence River. The British commander, General James Wolfe, launched a number of skirmishes all around Quebec to distract and confuse the French. He had the British Navy sail up and down the river so that the French would not be sure where they might attack next. They eventually seized the bluffs across the river, set up cannons, and began to fire into the city. But actually getting troops close to the city seemed like it would be hard, until General Wolfe discovered a narrow path up the cliffs below the city. And some of his elite troops, in the dead of night, landed on the beaches below the cliffs and began climbing up to the flat ground in front of the city, an area known as the Plains of Abraham. This picture shows the entire Battle of Quebec as if it's happening at once. The soldiers climbing up the cliffs in the dark of night, and the fighting on the Plains of Abraham in front of the city, where the French eventually risked leaving the safe walls of the city to charge against the British, which turned out to be a disaster for the French. Had they waited for reinforcements, things might have gone differently, although then again, it might have only delayed the inevitable, as the French really couldn't get many more reinforcements from Europe, whereas the British could, even if local soldiers had reached Quebec more quickly, and it would only probably have slowed things down. General Wolfe was shot multiple times on the battlefield and died on the field of battle. Although he lived long enough to hear that General Montcalm had agreed to surrender. It is a very famous painting, The Death of General Wolfe, which is interesting. Most of the men depicted around Wolfe were men who were closely associated with his campaign, even if they weren't necessarily at Quebec itself, and they represent important units in the battle. The man green is an American militiaman, one of Rogers' Rangers, reminding us that Americans did fight with the British in the French and Indian War, as the American colonists were still British. And there in the lower left, we see an Iroquois warrior there to assist the British as well. General Montcalm was wounded in the battle and died the next day. And with this great victory at Quebec, the war was largely over. Montreal would surrender without a fight almost exactly a year later. Some officials back in France were shocked that Montreal had surrendered so easily, but King Louis XV was more interested in the fighting in Europe, and the philosopher Voltaire tried to cheer him up. He said, "After all, what have we lost but a few acres of snow?" There were some battles fought in the South, too, including the Battle of Fort Loudoun, a British fort built south of modern-day Knoxville, originally to protect the families of Britain's Cherokee allies. But after a major disagreement with the Cherokee turned against the British, besieged Fort Loudoun. When the soldiers finally surrendered, they were promised safe passage back home, but on the way back home, attacked just as dawn was breaking. Every officer but one was killed. Most of the common soldiers were taken prisoner. The British commander, Paul Desmarais, was scalped, forced to dance, beaten with sticks, and finally had his arms and legs chopped off. As he lay dying, the Cherokee warrior stuffed his mouth with dirt and said, "You English want land. We will give it to you." In response, though, more British soldiers went in to slaughter the Cherokee and burn their crops, eventually forcing them to sign a peace treaty. And despite this harsh treatment, the Cherokee would actually ally with the British again around the time of the American Revolution. And there were other battles elsewhere as well, but these are some of the key ones. The war came officially to an end in 1763 with the Peace of Paris, or Treaty of Paris. Britain gained almost all of France's territory in North America, seizing Canada, all of Louisiana between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains. They also seized Spanish Florida, Florida being an ally of Spain, Spain being an ally of France because their royal families were related. To make up for that loss, Spain was given the western portion of Louisiana. And some other land captured in various places by the British was returned to the French and to the Spanish. No borders in Europe of any significance changed. Britain was now master of North America, but Britain was also now much more involved in the lives of her American colonies, and the effects of the war would ultimately drive Britain and her colonies apart.